The first gunshot sent Zelda Garrison diving behind a water trough, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. It wasn't how she'd planned to spend her 23rd birthday dodging bullets outside the general store in Pinewood Springs, Colorado. The year was 1878, and the West was still wild enough that a woman alone had to know how to survive. "Stay down, miss." The deep voice came from somewhere to her left as a second shot splintered the wooden porch railing above her head. Zelda risked a glance toward the voice. A tall man in a dusty Stetson was crouched behind a hitching post, revolver drawn. His eyes, piercing blue even from this distance, met hers briefly before he returned his attention to the gunman at the other end of the street. "You missed again, Davis," the stranger called out. "Your aim's as crooked as your business dealings." The man called Davis fired again, the bullet whistling harmlessly into the dirt. "You've got one more shot, and then it's my turn," the stranger warned, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who knew his way around a gun. Zelda pulled her skirts tighter around her legs, wincing as a splinter from the rough-hewn trough dug into her palm. This wasn't the first gunfight she'd witnessed since arriving in Pinewood Springs 3 months ago, but it was certainly the closest she'd been to the action. The final shot from Davis's gun went wide, and in the moment of silence that followed, Zelda heard the distinctive click of an empty chamber. The stranger moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, stepping out from his cover and firing once. Davis yelped, his gun dropping to the dirt as he clutched his shoulder. 2 men from the saloon rushed out to restrain him before he could cause any more trouble. Only then did the stranger holster his weapon and approach Zelda, extending his hand to help her up. "My apologies for the excitement, miss. Are you hurt?" Zelda accepted his help, brushing dust from her simple blue dress as she rose to her feet. "I'm unharmed, thank you, though I believe I've ruined my new gloves." She tried for levity, holding up her now dirty white gloves. The man's face broke into a smile that transformed his weather-beaten features. "Yates Keller," he said, tipping his hat. "Ranch foreman at the Triple Diamond." "Zelda Garrison," she replied, taking in the sight of him properly for the first time. He stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered but lean, with a face tanned by years under the sun. His brown hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck, and a scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the short beard that covered his chin. "Miss Garrison," he acknowledged. "I've seen you at the schoolhouse. You're the new teacher." Zelda nodded, surprised he'd noticed her at all. Most of the townspeople still regarded her as an outsider, despite her position. "And you just shot a man in broad daylight, Mr. Keller." "Only winged him," Yates corrected, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Davis has been rustling Triple Diamond cattle for months. Sheriff's been promising to handle it, but," he shrugged, "sometimes a man's got to take matters into his own hands." "I see," Zelda said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. The West operated under different rules than the Boston society she'd left behind. The sheriff finally appeared, looking harried as he approached them. "Keller, what in tarnation is going on here?" "Caught Davis red-handed with Triple Diamond calves, Sheriff. He drew first when I confronted him." The sheriff sighed heavily, pushing his hat back on his head. "We'll sort this out at the office. Miss Garrison, are you all right?" "Perfectly fine, Sheriff Peters," Zelda assured him, though her racing heart suggested otherwise. "Good, then if you'll excuse us." The sheriff led Yates away, leaving Zelda standing alone by the water trough. She gathered her scattered packages, her hands still trembling slightly. When she glanced up, she caught several townswomen watching her from across the street, their heads bent together in obvious gossip. Mrs. Holloway, the mayor's wife, made no attempt to lower her voice. There she goes again, that Boston girl, right in the middle of trouble. No proper young lady would have gotten herself involved in a gunfight. "Did you see how she looked at Keller? Brazen as can be," added Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife. "She'll never find a husband behaving that way," Mrs. Holloway continued. "Too outspoken, too educated. What man wants a wife who corrects his grammar?" Zelda straightened her spine and lifted her chin, pretending their words didn't sting. She'd heard it all before. Unfit for marriage, they called her. Too independent, too opinionated, too much of everything a woman wasn't supposed to be. It was why she'd left Boston after breaking her engagement to Henry Whitfield, a man who'd wanted to clip her wings and keep her caged like a pretty bird. She'd come west to start anew, to be the kind of woman she wanted to be. If that meant she'd never marry, so be it. As she made her way back to the small cabin that served as both her home and the town's schoolhouse, Zelda couldn't help but think about the piercing blue eyes of Yates Keller, and the way they'd looked at her not with judgment, but with something that felt remarkably like appreciation. The following morning, Zelda rose before dawn as was her custom. She stoked the fire in the small stove, put water on to boil for coffee, and began preparing for the day's lessons. The cabin that served as both schoolhouse and her living quarters was modest but functional, with a curtain separating her small bedroom from the main room where 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 16 gathered each weekday. She'd just finished pinning up her hair when a knock sounded at the door. Frowning, she checked the clock. It was barely 6, too early for students or most visitors. When she opened the door, she was startled to find Yates Keller standing on her porch, hat in hand. "Mr. Keller," she said, quickly adjusting her shawl around her shoulders. "This is unexpected. Miss Garrison," he nodded politely. "I hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "Not at all, but may I ask why you're here?" Yates shifted slightly, looking almost uncomfortable. It was a stark contrast to the confident man who had faced down a gun the previous day. "I wanted to check that you were truly all right after yesterday's excitement, and—" He hesitated, then produced a small package from behind his back. "To replace your gloves, I noticed they were damaged." Zelda stared at the package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple string. "You bought me gloves." It seemed the gentlemanly thing to do, considering. She accepted the package, momentarily speechless. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful but unnecessary. May I come in for a moment?" Yates asked, glancing past her into the schoolhouse. Propriety dictated she should refuse. An unmarried woman receiving a man alone in her home would set tongues wagging even more than they already were. But something about Yates Keller made Zelda want to defy convention, as she so often did. "Briefly," she conceded, stepping back to allow him entry, "I have coffee brewing." "That would be welcome. Been riding since before dawn." Zelda gestured toward one of the student desks. "Please sit, though I'm afraid it might be a bit small for you." Yates chuckled, folding his tall frame awkwardly onto one of the benches. "I expect it's been a while since I fit in a school desk." Zelda poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to him. "So, Mr. Keller, what happened with Sheriff Peters yesterday?" "Call me Yates, please." He took a sip of the coffee, nodding appreciatively. "And nothing much. Davis will stand trial for cattle rustling once his shoulder heals. The sheriff gave me a lecture about taking the law into my own hands, then bought me a drink at the saloon." "That seems inconsistent," Zelda remarked. "That's the West for you, Miss Garrison." "Zelda," she corrected him with a small smile, "if we're dispensing with formalities." "Zelda," he repeated, and something about the way her name sounded in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She opened the package he'd brought, finding a pair of fine leather gloves inside. "These are beautiful, but surely too expensive to replace a pair of cotton gloves." Yates shrugged. "The mercantile didn't have cotton ones in your size. Besides, leather holds up better out here." Zelda ran her fingers over the supple material. "I've never owned leather gloves before." "They'll serve you well when winter comes. Gets mighty cold up here in the mountains." "I've been warned," Zelda said, thinking of the many dire predictions she'd received about her first Colorado winter. "I'm told my eastern blood is too thin for the climate." "You seem plenty resilient to me," Yates observed, watching her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Most ladies I know would have fainted dead away at the first gunshot yesterday," Zelda laughed. "I've never been much for fainting." "My father always said I had more backbone than sense." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Zelda said softly, the familiar pang of grief surfacing briefly. "He died 2 years ago. He was a professor at Harvard." "I'm sorry for your loss," Yates said, and the genuine sympathy in his voice touched her. "Is that why you came west?" Zelda hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Partly. After he died, there seemed little reason to stay in Boston. No family, no immediate family. My mother passed when I was young. I have cousins, but we were never close. She didn't mention Henry or the scandal her broken engagement had caused. What about you? Are you from Colorado originally? Yates shook his head. Texas born and raised. Came up this way after the war, looking for a fresh start. You fought in the war? Zelda asked, noting that his age, perhaps 30 or 31, would have made him very young during the conflict. Last year of it. Lied about my age to enlist. A shadow crossed his face. Saw enough in those months to last a lifetime. Zelda wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she said, and you found your fresh start as a ranch foreman, eventually. Did a lot of different jobs, first cowpuncher, trail hand, even tried my hand at mining for a spell. He smiled. Found I prefer the company of cattle to most men, yet here you are, taking coffee with the schoolteacher, Zelda pointed out. Well now, I didn't say all men. His eyes met hers with a warmth that made her cheeks flush, or women in this case. The sound of childish voices outside the door broke the moment. Yates stood immediately, returning his cup to Zelda. That'll be my cue to leave. Thank you for the coffee. Zelda walked him to the door, aware of the curious stares of her early arriving students. Thank you again for the gloves, Mr. Keller. Yates. He settled his hat back on his head, the movement practiced and fluid. My pleasure, Zelda. Perhaps I'll see you in town sometime. Perhaps, she agreed, though she knew the chances of their paths crossing regularly were slim. The Triple Diamond Ranch was a good 10 miles outside of Pinewood Springs, and her duties kept her busy in town. As she watched him mount his horse, a magnificent black gelding, and ride away, Zelda was startled by a tug on her skirt. Miss Garrison. It was Emma Patterson, one of her younger students. Was that the cowboy who shot Mr. Davis yesterday? It was, Emma, Zelda acknowledged, ushering the girl inside. Now, let's prepare for our lessons, shall we? My ma says you shouldn't talk to men like him, Emma continued innocently. She says he's dangerous. Your mother is entitled to her opinion, Zelda said diplomatically. Now, please take your seat. As the schoolhouse filled with children, Zelda pushed thoughts of Yates Keller to the back of her mind. She had a job to do, a position to maintain, and the last thing she needed was to give the town more reason to question her suitability as their schoolteacher. Still, as she began the day's mathematics lesson, she couldn't help but think of piercing blue eyes and a smile that transformed a hardened face into something unexpectedly gentle. 3 weeks passed before Zelda saw Yates again. She'd begun to think their brief encounters had been just that, fleeting moments unlikely to be repeated. The leather gloves he'd given her remained carefully stored in her trunk, too fine for everyday use. Life in Pinewood Springs had settled into a comfortable routine. Zelda taught during the day, took her evening meals at the boarding house run by the widow Mrs. Jenkins, and spent her nights reading or preparing lessons. On Sundays, she attended church services, though she often felt the scrutiny of the congregation more keenly there than anywhere else. It was on a crisp Saturday morning in early October that their paths crossed again. Zelda had taken advantage of the beautiful autumn day to organize a nature study for her students. They were scattered across the meadow at the edge of town, collecting leaves and identifying plants when the sound of approaching horses caught her attention. A group of cowboys rode into view, dust rising from beneath their horses' hooves. At their head was a figure she recognized immediately: Yates Keller, sitting tall in the saddle, his easy command of both his mount and the men who followed him evident in every movement. Zelda called her students to gather, concerned about the approaching riders, but relaxed when she saw Yates raise a hand in greeting. Miss Garrison, he called, guiding his horse toward her while gesturing for his men to continue on. Schooling outdoors today. Nature studies, Mr. Keller, she replied, aware of 12 pairs of curious eyes watching them. The children are learning to identify local flora. Yates dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse by the reins as he approached. Important knowledge out here. Helps to know what'll feed you and what'll kill you. Several of the boys giggled at his blunt assessment. Indeed, Zelda agreed, fighting a smile. though I've been focusing on classification rather than survival skills. Both have their place." He tipped his hat to the assembled children. "Morning, young scholars." A chorus of greetings replied, the children unusually animated. Zelda knew that to them, a cowboy like Yates with his gun belt, spurs, and air of adventure was far more interesting than leaf classifications. "Are you going to town, Mr. Keller?" she asked. "Heading there now, bringing some of the boys in for supplies and a bit of recreation." His expression suggested he didn't entirely approve of the latter. "We're moving the herd to winter pastures next week. That sounds like a significant undertaking." "It is." He glanced at the children, then back to Zelda. "Say, would your students like a demonstration of rope work? Might make for an educational interlude." The excited murmurs from her pupils made Zelda's decision easy. "We would be delighted, Mr. Keller." For the next 20 minutes, Yates demonstrated various knots and rope techniques, explaining their uses on the range with patience and humor. He even allowed some of the older boys to try their hand at a simple lasso, much to their delight. Zelda watched him with the children, impressed by his natural teaching ability and the ease with which he engaged even the shyest students. It was a side of him she hadn't expected the gunslinger revealed as an educator. "You're good with them," she observed quietly when the demonstration concluded and the children had returned to their leaf collecting. Yates coiled his rope with practiced hands. "Had a lot of younger siblings growing up, got used to explaining things." "How many siblings?" "5. I was the eldest." A shadow passed over his face. "Lost 2 brothers in the war, though, and my youngest sister to fever." "I'm sorry," Zelda said, touched by the grief that still lingered in his voice. He shrugged, the gesture not dismissive but accepting. "Life out here's never been guaranteed. You learn to treasure what time you get." The philosophical observation surprised her, revealing depths to the cowboy she hadn't glimpsed before. "Will you be in town long?" Zelda asked, changing the subject. "Just today, need to get back to prepare for the move." He hesitated, then added, "Though I was hoping I might call on you while I'm here. Perhaps escort you to dinner at the hotel." The invitation caught Zelda off guard. That's very kind, but I usually take my meals at Mrs. Jenkins's boarding house." "I know, Mrs. Jenkins mentioned you never miss a meal there." At her raised eyebrow, he added, "Small towns, remember, everyone knows everyone's business." "So I've discovered," Zelda said dryly. "The hotel dining room serves a fine steak on Saturdays," Yates persisted. "Better than Mrs. Jenkins's mystery stew, I'd wager." Zelda hesitated, torn between propriety and desire. Dining publicly with Yates would certainly set tongues wagging, yet she found herself wanting to accept to spend more time in his company. "Very well," she agreed finally. "What time shall I expect you?" 6 o'clock. Relief and pleasure mingled in his smile. "I'll come to the schoolhouse. I'll be ready." She returned his smile, ignoring the flutter in her stomach. One of his men called to him then, and Yates reluctantly took his leave, mounting his horse with easy grace. "Until this evening, Miss Garrison." As he rode toward town, Zelda became aware of Lily Thompson, her oldest student, standing nearby with a knowing smile. "Not a word, Lily," Zelda warned good-naturedly. "I didn't say anything, Miss Garrison," the 16-year-old replied innocently. "But my ma says Mr. Keller's the most eligible bachelor in the county, even if he is just a cowboy." "Is that so?" Zelda tried to sound disinterested. "MMHMM. She says he turned down Abigail Franklin last spring, and she's the prettiest girl in 3 counties. "Lily, this is hardly appropriate conversation." "Sorry, Miss Garrison." The girl didn't look remotely sorry. "I just think it's romantic is all, the way he looks at you." "How does he look at me?" The question slipped out before Zelda could stop it. Lily's smile widened. "Like your water, and he's been riding through the desert for days." Zelda felt her cheeks warm. "That's quite enough, Lily. Please continue with your leaf collection." As she watched her student skip away, Zelda wondered what she had gotten herself into by accepting Yates's invitation. One dinner might seem innocent enough, but in a town like Pinewood Springs, it would be tantamount to a declaration of intentions. And what were his intentions? More importantly, what were hers? Zelda had come west to escape the constraints of Boston society, to build a life on her own terms. Romance had been nowhere in her plans after the disaster with Henry. Yet something about Yates Keller's direct gaze and quiet confidence intrigued her in ways she hadn't expected. As she gathered her students to return to town, Zelda found herself looking forward to the evening with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Whatever came of it, she suspected her life in Pinewood Springs was about to become considerably more complicated. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at the schoolhouse door. Zelda, who had been ready for nearly half an hour, took a deep breath before answering. Yates stood on her porch, hat in hand. He'd exchanged his work clothes for a clean, dark shirt and vest, his boots polished, his hair neatly combed. The gun belt remained at his hip, a necessary accessory in the West, but even that looked more ceremonial than utilitarian this evening. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his eyes taking in her emerald green dress, one of the few fine garments she'd brought from Boston. "Thank you." Zelda smoothed her skirts nervously. "You clean up well yourself, Mr. Keller. Back to formalities?" he asked with a slight smile. "I thought we'd moved past that. Habit," she admitted. "When I'm nervous," his expression softened. "No need to be nervous, it's just dinner." But they both knew it wasn't just dinner. In Pinewood Springs, their appearance together at the hotel would be noticed, discussed, analyzed. By tomorrow morning, half the town would be speculating about their relationship. Yates offered his arm. "Shall we?" The walk to the hotel took less than 10 minutes, but Zelda felt every pair of eyes that turned their way. Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Peterson, standing outside the millinery shop, barely concealed their shock. The blacksmith, Mr. Gordon, gave Yates a knowing nod. Even Sheriff Peters, leaning against the jailhouse porch, raised his eyebrows in surprise. By the time they reached the hotel dining room, Zelda's nerves had returned in full force. The maitre d' showed them to a table by the window, the most visible spot in the room, of course. "Everyone is staring," Zelda murmured as Yates held her chair. "Let them," he replied, taking his own seat. "They'll find something new to gossip about tomorrow. You seem unconcerned about your reputation." "My reputation?" Yates looked genuinely puzzled. "I'm not the one whose reputation is at stake here, Zelda." "No." "The eligible bachelor dining with the outspoken schoolteacher who's been deemed unfit for marriage." She kept her voice light, though the words stung to say aloud. Yates's expression darkened. "Who said that about you?" "Everyone, more or less." Zelda unfolded her napkin, avoiding his eyes. "It's not exactly a secret that the good ladies of Pinewood Springs find me unsuitable. Unsuitable for what? Marriage, primarily. They think I'm too independent, too educated, too much." She tried to smile, but it felt brittle. "Mrs. Holloway told me quite directly that no frontier man wants a wife who can quote Shakespeare and calculate complex mathematics." Yates was quiet for a moment, studying her. When he spoke, his voice was low and intense. "Mrs. Holloway and her ilk don't speak for all frontier men." The waiter's arrival interrupted what promised to be a charged moment. They ordered steak for Yates, chicken for Zelda, and fell into easier conversation as they waited for their food. Yates told her about the Triple Diamond Ranch, about the challenges and rewards of managing thousands of acres and hundreds of cattle. Zelda shared stories about her students and her adjustments to life in the West. "Do you miss Boston?" Yates asked as they enjoyed their meal. Zelda considered the question. "I miss certain aspects, the libraries, the theaters, the museums. The changing of the season's autumn in New England is particularly beautiful. But not enough to go back. No," she said firmly. "There's nothing for me there now." Yates seemed to weigh his next words carefully. "There was someone, wasn't there? A man." Zelda's fork paused midway to her mouth. "What makes you say that, the way you left Boston, coming all this way alone, taking a position in a town most Easterners have never heard of?" His gaze was steady. "Speaks of leaving something behind, not just seeking something new." She set her fork down, impressed by his perception. "Yes, there was someone. Henry Whitfield. We were engaged." "What happened?" "I discovered we wanted very different things." Zelda took a sip of water, organizing her thoughts. "Henry wanted a wife who would host dinner parties and produce heirs. who would be content with charitable work and social calls, who would never challenge him or express an opinion that differed from his own. And that wasn't you? No, she met his eyes. I wanted to teach, to make a difference. To use the education my father had insisted I receive despite society's disapproval. Henry found that unacceptable, so you ended it. I did. It caused quite the scandal. Henry's family is prominent in Boston society, and they made sure everyone knew I had jilted their son. Zelda's lips curved in a humorless smile. When my father died shortly after, there seemed little reason to stay. Yates reached across the table, his hand covering hers briefly. His loss, our gain. The simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, warmed something inside Zelda that had been cold for a very long time. What about you? She asked. No wife waiting at the Triple Diamond. No, Yates cut another piece of his steak, never found the right woman. Or perhaps never looked hard enough. And what would the right woman be for Yates Keller? Zelda asked, genuinely curious. He considered the question seriously. Someone strong, independent-minded, not afraid of hard work or hard truths. A smile touched his lips. Someone who can quote Shakespeare while calculating complex mathematics might be just about perfect. Zelda felt her cheeks warm at the obvious reference to her earlier comments. You're mocking me. I assure you I'm not. His expression was entirely earnest. A man who spent most of his life on the frontier appreciates substance over frippery, Zelda. Intelligence over empty-headed beauty, courage over compliance. That's not the prevailing view in Pinewood Springs. Then Pinewood Springs is full of fools. Yates held her gaze. Present company excluded, of course. Zelda couldn't help but laugh. You're not what I expected, Yates Keller. I hope that's a good thing. I'm beginning to think it might be. The rest of the meal passed in comfortable conversation, and Zelda found herself relaxing despite the curious glances from other diners. Yates was an engaging companion, well-read despite his lack of formal education, thoughtful in his opinions, and possessed of a dry wit that frequently made her laugh. By the time they left the hotel, the autumn evening had turned cool, and Zelda was glad of her shawl. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear mountain sky, far more numerous and bright than they had ever appeared in Boston. May I walk you home? Yates asked, though they both knew it was a foregone conclusion. Yes, thank you. They strolled slowly through the darkened town, their path lit by the occasional lamplight from windows and the nearly full moon overhead. Zelda was acutely aware of Yates's presence beside her, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers. When do you leave for the winter pastures? She asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Monday morning, first light, he replied. It'll take us about a week to move the herd, then another week to set up the winter camp, so you'll be gone for some time. 2 weeks, at least, he glanced at her. Would you mind if I wrote to you? The question surprised her. You want to correspond, unless that would be unwelcome. No, not unwelcome at all, Zelda assured him quickly. I'd like that very much. They had reached the schoolhouse, and Zelda turned to face him on the small porch. I enjoyed this evening, she said softly. Thank you, as did I. Yates stood close, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. May I call on you again when I return? Yes, Zelda answered without hesitation. I'd like that. For a moment she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and he seemed to sway slightly forward. But then he stepped back, taking her hand instead and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Good night, Zelda Garrison. Sleep well. Good night, Yates. She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the moonlit street, and felt a curious mixture of disappointment and anticipation. Something was beginning between them, something unexpected and potentially wonderful. As she prepared for bed that night, Zelda found herself wondering what her father would have thought of Yates Keller. Professor William Garrison had been a progressive thinker, a man who believed in women's education and suffrage long before such views were popular. Would he have approved of the cowboy with the thoughtful eyes and quick mind? Somehow she thought he might have. And that realization brought her more comfort than she had expected. True to his word, Yates's first letter arrived 10 days after he'd left Pinewood Springs. It was delivered by one of the triple diamond hands who'd come to town for supplies. A young cowboy named Tom who tipped his hat shyly to Zelda as he handed her the envelope. The letter was written in a surprisingly elegant hand on plain paper, the creases suggesting it had been composed in the field rather than at a proper desk. Dear Zelda, I hope this finds you well and that your students haven't driven you to distraction in my absence. We've reached the winter pastures and settled the herd without major incident, though Jenkins took a tumble crossing the river that will have him walking bow-legged for reasons beyond his usual saddle soreness. The country here is beautiful high meadows sheltered by pine forests, with a stream running clear and cold through the center. The cabin we use as winter headquarters is rustic but sound, with a stone fireplace that keeps the worst of the chill at bay. I'm writing by its light now, with the boys already snoring in their bunks. I find myself thinking often of our dinner together and of the conversations we've shared. It's rare to find someone in these parts with whom I can discuss books and ideas beyond the practical concerns of ranching. I've reread Thoreau's Walden by lamplight these past few nights and find his observations on solitude particularly resonant in these mountains. Tell me of your days. Has young Billy Thomas mastered his arithmetic? Has Mrs. Holloway found new reasons to disapprove of you? I find myself curious about the smallest details of your life in my absence. I expect to return to town in another week or so, depending on weather and the remaining work to be done here. Until then, know that you are in my thoughts. Yours, Yates. Zelda read the letter 3 times, touched by its warmth and the glimpse it provided into Yates's inner life. She had not expected literary references or thoughtful observations from a ranch foreman, though she chided herself for the prejudice that assumption revealed. That evening, after her students had gone home and she had finished grading their composition exercises, Zelda sat at her small desk and composed a reply. Dear Yates, your letter was a welcome surprise. I'm glad to hear the cattle drive was successful, though I sympathize with poor Mr. Jenkins's misfortune. Your winter camp sounds lovely. I find myself envying your proximity to unspoiled nature. Pinewood Springs, for all its remoteness by Eastern standards, still feels very much a human settlement with all the complications that entails. You asked about my days. They are filled with the usual challenges and rewards of teaching. Billy Thomas has indeed improved in his arithmetic, though he still approaches mathematics with the enthusiasm one might reserve for a dose of castor oil. Emma Patterson continues to show remarkable aptitude for literature and has taken to reciting Wordsworth during recess, much to the bewilderment of her classmates. As for Mrs. Holloway, she and her circle have been unusually attentive since our dinner together. I receive frequent visits at the schoolhouse, ostensibly to discuss educational matters, but invariably turning to subtle inquiries about your character and intentions. I assure you I have been discretion itself, revealing nothing while remaining unfailingly polite. It's a skill I perfected in Boston drawing rooms and find equally useful in Western parlors. I'm surprised but delighted by your mention of Thoreau. My father was acquainted with him slightly, through mutual friends at Harvard, and always spoke highly of his intellect if not his hygiene. Walden was a favorite of mine in younger days, though I now find myself more drawn to Emerson's essays. Perhaps we might discuss them when you return. The autumn colors are reaching their peak here. Yesterday I took the children on another nature walk, and we collected leaves in such vibrant shades of red and gold that my classroom now resembles a sunset. Winter will be upon us soon, I'm told, with the first snow often arriving before Thanksgiving. As someone who has only experienced New England winters, I admit to some trepidation about what Colorado might present. I look forward to your return to Pinewood Springs and to continuing our conversations in person. Warmly, Zelda. She sealed the letter carefully and gave it to Tom the next day when he stopped by the schoolhouse before leaving town. The young cowboy promised to deliver it directly to Yates, his expression suggesting that he found the whole business of carrying letters between his boss and the schoolteacher rather romantic. Zelda tried not to dwell on what that might mean, that the triple diamond hands were as aware of Yates's interest in her as the townspeople were. Instead, she focused on her teaching and on preparing for the approaching winter. The first snow came earlier than expected, a light dusting that transformed Pinewood Springs overnight in mid-October. Zelda woke to a world turned white and silent, the familiar landscape rendered new and mysterious. Her students were predictably excited, their attention wandering to the windows throughout the morning. By noon, Zelda conceded defeat and turned the day's lessons to the science of snow formation and the mathematics of snowflake symmetry. Concepts she illustrated by taking the children outside to collect and examine specimens on black cloth. They were in the midst of this exercise when the sound of horses approaching drew their attention. A small group of riders was coming down the main street, their figures dark against the snow-covered landscape. Zelda recognized Yates immediately, his posture in the saddle unmistakable even at a distance. Her heart quickened. He wasn't expected back for several more days. "Look, Miss Garrison, it's Mr. Keller and his men," called out Billy Thomas, always alert to anything more interesting than schoolwork. "I can see that, Billy," Zelda replied, striving for a calm she didn't feel. "Please continue with your observations," but the children's focus was irretrievably lost. By the time Yates and his companions reached the area in front of the schoolhouse, all 12 students were watching openly, scientific inquiry forgotten. Yates reined in his horse, his face breaking into a warm smile when he saw Zelda. He looked tired but well, his skin tanned even darker from days in the open, a growth of beard shadowing his jaw. "Miss Garrison," he called, tipping his hat. "Teaching in the snow." "Science waits for no weather, Mr. Keller," she returned, pleased that her voice remained steady despite the flutter in her chest. "A commendable attitude." He dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. "Might I have a word?" Zelda nodded, turning to her oldest student. "Lily, please oversee the continuation of our observations. I'll be just a moment." She moved a short distance away with Yates, aware of the curious gazes of both her students and his men. "You're back early," she said when they were relatively private, got the work done faster than expected. His eyes moved over her face as if reacquainting himself with her features. "Might have pushed the men a bit harder than usual to make it happen." "Oh," Zelda felt her cheeks warm despite the cold air. "Any particular reason?" Yates smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I got your letter, wanted to continue our conversation about Emerson in person." "I see, and this conversation about Emerson was so urgent it required a hasty return to town, among other reasons." He glanced at the schoolchildren, then back to Zelda. "When might I call on you properly?" "This evening. I have papers to grade," Zelda demurred, though her pulse quickened at the thought. "Bring them to dinner," Yates suggested. "The hotel again, 7 o'clock." She hesitated only briefly. "Very well, 7 o'clock. I'll be there." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Don't keep your students waiting in the cold on my account." As he remounted and rode off with his men, Zelda returned to her class, trying to ignore Lily Thompson's knowing smile. "Is Mr. Keller courting you, Miss Garrison?" the girl asked quietly as they resumed their observations. "That would be my business, Lily," Zelda replied, though not unkindly. "My pa says he's a good man, even if he is quick with a gun." Lily bent to examine a snowflake. "Says any girl would be lucky to catch his eye." Zelda chose not to respond to this, redirecting the conversation to the scientific matters at hand. But as the afternoon progressed, she found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the evening ahead, and to the man who had possibly ridden hard through mountain terrain just to see her sooner. The notion was as unsettling as it was flattering. Zelda had come to Colorado to escape the complications of romance, to build a life defined by her work rather than by a man's expectations. Yet here she was, anticipating dinner with Yates Keller with a schoolgirl's excitement. What was it about him that had slipped so effortlessly past her carefully constructed defenses? His intelligence, his respect for her independence, the way he looked at her, as if she were perfectly formed rather than fundamentally flawed. Whatever it was, Zelda knew she was treading dangerous ground. The heart, once engaged, was not easily disengaged. She had learned that painful lesson with Henry, though in a different way. If she allowed herself to care for Yates, to truly care, she would be risking the independence she had sacrificed so much to achieve. As she dismissed her students for the day, watching them scatter like quail into the snow-covered town, Zelda wondered if some risks might be worth taking after all. Yates arrived at the hotel 5 minutes before 7, having taken particular care with his appearance. He'd visited the barber for a proper shave, had his boots polished to a military shine, and was wearing his best shirt, a dark blue cotton that misses. Wilkins, the rancher's wife, had once told him brought out his eyes. He felt almost as nervous as he had before his first cattle drive, though the stakes here were considerably different. Zelda Garrison had occupied his thoughts to a degree that surprised even him during his time in the mountains. Her letter, with its intelligence and subtle humor, had only increased his fascination with the Boston schoolteacher who seemed so wonderfully out of place in Pinewood Springs. When she entered the hotel dining room at precisely 7, Yates rose to his feet, momentarily speechless. Zelda wore a deep blue dress that echoed the color of his shirt, her auburn hair arranged in an elegant style that highlighted the graceful curve of her neck. She carried a small portfolio that presumably contained the papers she had mentioned grading. "You look beautiful," he said when she reached the table, the words inadequate but sincere. "Thank you." Her smile was warm as she took the seat he held for her. "You're quite handsome yourself this evening. The barber did excellent work." Yates rubbed his jaw self-consciously. "Figured I should look civilized for town dining." "I didn't mind the beard," Zelda admitted, surprising him. "It suited you, did it now?" Yates felt disproportionately pleased by this small revelation. "I'll remember that." Their dinner conversation flowed easily, moving from literature to local gossip to Zelda's students and Yates's experiences in the mountains. She had a way of listening that made him feel his thoughts were valuable, his observations worth sharing, a rare quality in Yates's experience. "So," he said as they lingered over coffee, "you promised to tell me your thoughts on Emerson." Zelda's eyes lit up. "You remembered." "I remember everything you say," Yates replied, the admission more revealing than he had intended. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Emerson speaks to me more than Thoreau because he believes in engagement with the world rather than withdrawal from it. The purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well." "You've memorized him," Yates observed, "many passages. My father encouraged it, said great thoughts should be carried in the mind, not left on the page. Your father sounds like a remarkable man." "He was." Sadness flickered across her face. "I wish you could have met him. He would have enjoyed your perspective on things." "And what is my perspective in your estimation?" Yates asked, genuinely curious. Zelda considered him thoughtfully. "You see the world clearly, without pretense or illusion. You value honesty and competence above social niceties. Yet you have a poet's appreciation for beauty and meaning." She smiled slightly. "An unusual combination in my experience, particularly in a man who makes his living with cattle and guns. You make me sound more complicated than I am." "I think you're exactly as complicated as you are," Zelda replied, her eyes holding his. "No more, no less." Something in her direct gaze made Yates's heart beat faster. He had known many women in his 31 years, saloon girls and proper ladies, farm wives and widows and unmarried daughters. None had looked at him the way Zelda did, as if she were seeing not just his surface but the depths beneath. "Zelda," he began, then hesitated, unsure how to proceed. He was saved from his uncertainty by the arrival of Sheriff Peters at their table. "Evening, folks," the sheriff said, nodding to them both. "Sorry to interrupt your meal, but I need a word with you, Keller." Yates straightened, instantly alert. "What's happened?" "Davis escaped from custody this morning, stole a horse and headed south." The sheriff's expression was grim. "Word is he's been making threats against you since the trial date was set." Yates felt a cold anger settle in his stomach. "I'm not hard to find." That's what concerns me, Peters said. Man's unstable, Keller, and he's got friends who are equally unsavory. Thought you should know to keep your eyes open. I appreciate the warning, Yates replied evenly. The sheriff nodded to Zelda. Madam, sorry again for the interruption. After he had gone, Zelda looked at Yates with concern. This man, Davis, he's the one you shot, the cattle rustler, the same. Yates tried to keep his tone light, not wanting to worry her. Don't trouble yourself about it. Davis is a coward at heart. He won't come after me directly. But the sheriff seemed concerned. Peters worries too much. Yates reached across the table to cover her hand with his. Now, where were we before that interruption? I believe you were analyzing my complicated nature. Zelda allowed the change of subject, though her eyes remained troubled. They finished their meal in pleasant conversation, but Yates could sense a new tension in the air, a consciousness of danger that hadn't been present before. When he walked her home through the snow-covered streets, he found himself scanning the shadows more carefully than usual, his hand never straying far from his holstered gun. At the schoolhouse door, Zelda turned to face him. Will you be careful? With Davis, I mean. Always am, Yates assured her, touched by her concern. I've enjoyed your company these past weeks, she said, her voice soft in the quiet night. Letters and dinners and conversations, I would very much like them to continue. The simple statement, delivered with such quiet sincerity, moved Yates deeply. As would I. This time he didn't hesitate. Leaning down, he brushed his lips against hers in a gentle kiss, brief but unmistakably intentional. When he drew back, Zelda's eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted in surprise. Good night, Zelda, he said softly. Lock your door. She nodded wordlessly, her fingers touching her lips as if to confirm what had just happened. Yates waited until he heard the bolt slide into place before turning away, his mind already calculating the threat Davis might pose not just to him now, but potentially to Zelda as well. The thought of her in danger, because of her association with him, was unbearable. As he walked back to the hotel where he'd taken a room for the night, Yates resolved to speak with the Triple Diamond's owner about increasing security at the ranch. Davis might be a coward, but cowards could be dangerous when cornered, and a man facing prison for cattle rustling was cornered indeed. For the first time since arriving in Colorado years ago, Yates found himself questioning the wisdom of his chosen profession. A ranch foreman made enemies as a matter of course, rustlers, competing outfits, disgruntled former employees. It was a life that had suited his solitary nature well enough until now, but now there was Zelda to consider. Zelda, with her quick mind and courageous heart. Zelda, whose lips had felt so right against his own. Yates entered the hotel deep in thought, his evening with Zelda having taken a turn he hadn't anticipated in more ways than one. The weeks following the dinner at the hotel brought significant changes to Zelda's life in Pinewood Springs. Most notably, her relationship with Yates evolved from casual acquaintance to something that even the most gossipy townspeople had to acknowledge as courtship. Yates called at the schoolhouse regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book of poetry he'd found in Denver, a jar of honey from a beekeeper near the ranch, once even a small bouquet of late autumn wildflowers. They took walks together on Sunday afternoons, dined at the hotel when Yates was in town, and exchanged letters when his duties kept him at the ranch. The town's reaction was predictably mixed. Some, like Mrs. Jenkins, approved wholeheartedly, telling Zelda that it's about time Yates Keller found himself a good woman. Others, particularly Mrs. Holloway and her circle, regarded the relationship with suspicion and barely concealed disapproval. He's a hired man, after all, Zelda overheard Mrs. Holloway saying to Mrs. Peterson outside the general store one afternoon. And she's a professor's daughter. What can come of such a mismatch? Zelda had learned to ignore such comments, focusing instead on her teaching and on the growing connection between herself and Yates. Their conversations ranged widely, from literature to philosophy to the practical aspects of life in the West. She found in him a mind as curious and engaged as her own, though educated by experience rather than formal schooling. And then there were the kisses, increasingly less hesitant as their comfort with each other grew. Zelda had never experienced anything like the warmth that spread through her when Yates's lips met hers, the way the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them in those moments. It was during one such moment, on a crisp November evening as they stood on the schoolhouse porch after a dinner at the hotel, that the sound of a gunshot shattered the quiet night. Yates reacted instantly, pulling Zelda down into a crouch and shielding her with his body as a second shot splintered the porch railing. "Inside, now," he ordered, his voice tense as he drew his revolver. They scrambled through the door, Yates kicking it shut behind them as another shot hit the wooden frame. "Stay down, away from the windows," he instructed, moving to extinguish the lamp that would make them visible silhouettes. In the sudden darkness, Zelda heard the rapid pounding of her own heart. "Davis," she whispered, "most likely." Yates was a shadow moving along the wall, his gun held ready. "Are you all right?" "Yes." Despite her fear, Zelda's voice remained steady. "What do we do?" "Wait." "Sheriff will have heard the shots." He reached the window, carefully peering out from the side of the curtain. "Can't see anyone out there." Another shot came, this one hitting the window frame and sending glass shards scattering across the schoolroom floor. Zelda flinched but remained where Yates had positioned her, crouched behind her desk. "Keller," a voice called from the darkness outside. "Come out and face me like a man." "That's Davis," Yates confirmed grimly. "I know you're in there with your fancy woman." Davis continued, his voice slurred with what might be alcohol or pain or both. "Come out, or I'll burn the place down around you both." Zelda's breath caught at the threat. The schoolhouse was primarily wood, like most buildings in Pinewood Springs. A fire would consume it quickly, potentially spreading to neighboring structures. "He wouldn't," she began, but Yates cut her off. "He would. Davis has nothing left to lose." His voice was calm despite the danger, his mind clearly working through options. "We need to get you out of here." "Not without you," Zelda insisted. "Zelda, no," she said firmly. "Whatever plan you make, it includes both of us or neither." Even in the darkness, she could sense his reluctant smile. "Stubborn woman." "You've mentioned that before," she reminded him. "Now, what options do we have?" Before Yates could answer, they heard the distinctive sound of a match striking, followed by Davis's voice again. "Last chance, Keller. Come out now or watch your lady friend's home burn." Yates moved toward the rear of the schoolhouse. "There's a back window in your bedroom." "Small, but we might be able to slip through it." Zelda followed him, navigating by memory through the darkened building. And then we run for the sheriff's office. It's not far." They reached her small bedroom, and Yates quickly assessed the window. "I'll go first, make sure it's clear, then I'll help you through." He was halfway through the window when a third voice joined the night Sheriff Peters, his authoritative tone carrying clearly, "Davis, drop your weapon, you're surrounded." A barrage of gunfire followed Davis shooting at the sheriff and what sounded like several deputies returning fire. Yates pulled himself back inside. "Stay here," he ordered, moving toward the front of the schoolhouse again. "Yates, no." Zelda grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there." "I can help Peters. Or get yourself killed," she countered. "The sheriff has deputies. Let them handle this." The gunfire outside intensified, then abruptly stopped. In the silence that followed, they heard the sheriff's voice again. "Keller, Miss Garrison, are you folks all right in there?" Yates moved cautiously to the front door. "We're fine, Sheriff. Davis won't be troubling anyone again," came the grim reply. "Safe to come out now." Zelda followed Yates onto the porch, where the sheriff and 3 deputies stood over a figure lying motionless in the snow. A torch lay nearby, extinguished by the damp ground or deliberate action. "He was going to throw that at your schoolhouse," Peters explained, nodding toward the torch. "Got him just in time." Zelda stared at the fallen man, a complex mixture of relief and regret washing over her. Davis had tried to kill them, would have burned down her home and school without hesitation. Yet the sight of him lying dead in the snow, blood staining the white ground, filled her with a profound sadness for the waste of a human life. Yates must have sensed her distress, for his arm came around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "You should stay at the hotel tonight," he said quietly. I'll speak with Mrs. Jenkins about making arrangements." "The children will be here in the morning," Zelda protested weakly, though the thought of spending the night in the schoolhouse after what had happened made her shudder. "School can wait a day," Sheriff Peters interjected. "I'll post a notice first thing tomorrow." As the deputies removed Davis's body and the sheriff took their statements about the events of the evening, Zelda found herself leaning more heavily against Yates, the delayed reaction to danger making her limbs feel oddly weightless. "You're trembling," Yates observed, his arm tightening around her. "It's the cold," Zelda claimed, though they both knew otherwise. Later, settled in a small room at the hotel with a cup of hot tea provided by the sympathetic proprietor, Zelda finally allowed the full impact of the night's events to register. They could have died. The schoolhouse could have burned. The children would have lost their education, the town a vital institution. A soft knock at the door interrupted her dark thoughts. "Zelda, it's Yates. May I come in?" She opened the door to find him standing there, his face lined with concern. "I know it's improper," he began, "but I wanted to make sure you were truly all right." "I'm not concerned with propriety at the moment," Zelda admitted, stepping back to allow him entry. "Please come in." Yates entered hesitantly, remaining near the door as if to preserve some semblance of decorum despite the breach. "Sheriff's posting a deputy outside the hotel tonight just as a precaution, but Davis was working alone as far as we can tell. That's reassuring." Zelda returned to her seat by the small fireplace, though I find I'm more shaken than I expected to be. "It's a natural reaction," Yates said gently. "Most people aren't accustomed to being shot at." "Are you accustomed to it, I mean?" He considered the question seriously. "Not accustomed exactly, but I've faced it enough times that the fear becomes manageable. You weren't afraid tonight." "I was terrified," he admitted quietly. "Not for myself, for you." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "Yates," Zelda began, then faltered, unsure how to proceed. There were things she wanted to say, feelings she was only beginning to understand herself. He saved her from her uncertainty, moving to kneel beside her chair and take her hands in his. "I need to say something, Zelda. Tonight made me realize I can't keep it to myself any longer." His blue eyes were intense in the firelight. "I've fallen in love with you, completely, irrevocably in love, and the thought of losing you, of something happening to you because of me, is unbearable." Zelda's breath caught at the declaration. "Because of you? Yates, what happened tonight wasn't your fault. Davis came after me and you were caught in the middle." His grip on her hands tightened. "My life, the work I do, it attracts danger sometimes. I've accepted that for myself. But I have no right to expose you to it." Understanding dawned. Are you ending our relationship?" "No," he said quickly. "God, no, unless that's what you want." "It isn't," Zelda assured him, her own feelings crystallizing in the moment of potential loss. "Not at all." "Because I love you too, Yates." Tonight made that clearer than ever. Relief washed over his features, followed by a joy so profound it transformed his face. "You do?" "I do." Zelda reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. "I love your mind, your heart, your courage. I love the way you see me not as a problem to be solved or a wild creature to be tamed, but as a person worthy of respect and affection just as I am." Yates turned his head to press a kiss into her palm. "You are the most magnificent woman I've ever known, Zelda Garrison, and if you'll have me, dangers and all, I want to spend my life showing you just how perfect you are to me." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Keller?" Zelda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's working up to one," he admitted with a small smile. "Though I had planned something more romantic than a hotel room after a gunfight." Zelda laughed softly, the sound releasing some of the tension of the evening. "I think nearly dying together is rather romantic in its way." "You have unusual standards, Miss Garrison, so I've been told." She leaned forward until their foreheads touched. "And yes, Yates Keller, when you properly ask me to marry you, preferably without bullets flying, my answer will be yes." He kissed her then, a kiss that held all the relief and joy and lingering fear of the night, a kiss that promised a future neither of them had expected to find in Pinewood Springs. When they finally parted, Yates stood reluctantly. I should go before I completely ruin your reputation." "My reputation was already in question the moment I agreed to dine with you," Zelda reminded him wryly. "But yes, propriety suggests you should leave." At the door, he turned back to her, his expression suddenly serious. "Zelda, are you certain about this about us? Your life would change significantly as my wife. The ranch is remote, the work never ending. You'd be giving up your teaching, your independence." "Would I?" Zelda challenged gently. "Would you expect me to stop teaching, to abandon my beliefs and interests?" "No," Yates said without hesitation. "I'd never ask that of you, but the practical realities can be managed," she finished for him. "Perhaps not immediately, but in time. There are children at the Triple Diamond and neighboring ranches who need education, are there not?" "There are," he acknowledged. "Then perhaps I'll establish a new school there, or perhaps I'll write the textbooks I've always felt were needed for frontier education." Zelda smiled at him. "I don't see marriage to you as an ending, Yates, but as a beginning a partnership between equals who face life's challenges together." The tension eased from his shoulders. "When you put it that way, it sounds like the most natural thing in the world." "I believe it could be," Zelda said softly, "for us." After Yates had gone, promising to return in the morning to escort her to breakfast, Zelda sat by the fire for a long time, contemplating the dramatic turn her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a disgraced ex-fiancé in Boston, facing a future of spinsterhood and whispered judgments. Now she was a respected teacher in Colorado, in love with a man who valued her precisely for the qualities others had deemed flaws. The West, for all its dangers and hardships, had offered her a freedom she'd never found in the supposedly civilized East, the freedom to be herself, to be loved for herself, to build a life on her own terms. As she finally prepared for bed, exhausted but oddly at peace despite the night's violence, Zelda found herself recalling another passage from Emerson. "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." In Yates Keller's eyes, she had found not just love, but the rarest of gifts, acceptance of her true self without condition or compromise. Winter settled over Pinewood Springs with a series of heavy snowstorms that transformed the town into a landscape of white silence. The schoolhouse, repaired after Davis's attack, became a warm haven for Zelda's students, who arrived each morning with red cheeks and stories of adventures in the snow. Zelda and Yates's engagement was announced formally in early December, to reactions that ranged from genuine delight to barely concealed disapproval. Mrs. Jenkins organized a small celebration at the boarding house, attended by the school's trustees, several of Yates's ranch colleagues, and a few of the more progressive townspeople. Mrs. Holloway and her circle were conspicuously absent, having declared the match unsuitable and doomed to failure. Their prediction that she'll never adapt to ranch life and he'll never be civilized enough for her became common knowledge around town, though neither Zelda nor Yates paid it much mind. "They said I was unfit for marriage long before you appeared," Zelda reminded Yates one evening as they sat by the fire in the schoolhouse, reviewing plans for their future. "Their disapproval is almost reassuring. It suggests we're doing something right." Yates laughed, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "Their loss is my gain. If they had their way, you'd be married to some shopkeeper who'd have you arranging flowers and hosting tea parties instead of educating children and discussing Emerson with cowboys." "A tragic fate indeed," Zelda agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Though I have nothing against flower arranging or tea parties in moderation." They had decided to marry in the spring, after the school term ended. Yates had secured permission from the ranch owner to renovate and expand the foreman's cabin to accommodate a wife and eventually, they both hoped, children. In the meantime, Zelda had begun exploring the possibility of establishing a small school for the ranch children and those from neighboring properties. Mr. Wilkinson seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the idea, she told Yates, referring to the Triple Diamond's owner. He said his own children have been woefully neglected educationally, with only their mother's occasional lessons. "The man values education," Yates confirmed. He's offered to provide a building and basic supplies if you can organize the teaching. That's more support than most frontier schools receive, Zelda observed. It's a promising start. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, unusual for the evening hour. Yates rose to answer it, his hand automatically checking the revolver he still wore, a habit Zelda had come to accept as necessary in their world. Sheriff Peters stood on the porch, snow dusting his hat and coat. "Evening, folks. Sorry to disturb you, but there's a situation I thought you should know about." Yates invited him in, and Zelda quickly provided coffee to ward off the chill. "Davis's brother arrived in town today," the sheriff explained without preamble. "Hiram Davis. Mean piece of work, by all accounts, and making noise about avenging his brother's death." Zelda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. "Is he threatening us specifically?" "Not in so many words, but he's been asking questions about both of you." Spent the afternoon drinking at the saloon, telling anyone who'd listen that his brother was murdered. Peters looked grave. "I've warned him officially that such talk is slander against my office, but the man's grief-stricken and angry, not a good combination." Yates's expression had hardened. "Where is he now?" "Sleeping it off in my jail cell. I'll release him in the morning with a strong suggestion that he move on." The sheriff sighed. "But I thought you should be aware, take precautions." "I appreciate the warning," Yates said. "I'll stay here tonight if that's acceptable to you, Zelda." She nodded immediately. After the experience with Davis, the idea of Yates's protective presence was deeply reassuring. "Probably wise," the sheriff agreed. "I'll have a deputy patrol this area through the night as well." After Peters had gone, Zelda found herself trembling slightly as she cleared away the coffee cups. Will this ever end, this cycle of violence and revenge? Yates came to her, gently taking the cups from her hands and setting them aside. Some men can't let go of hatred, even when it destroys them. Davis chose his path, and now his brother seems determined to follow it. And we're caught in their wake. Not for long. Yates led her back to the fire, settling her on the small sofa. If Hiram Davis is wise, he'll heed the sheriff's warning and leave town. If not, he left the implication hanging. If not, there could be more violence, Zelda finished quietly. "I won't let him harm you," Yates promised, his voice low and intense. "Whatever happens, Zelda, your safety is my priority." She leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I know. But I worry for you as well, Yates. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of this vendetta." "Nothing will happen to either of us," he assured her with more confidence than perhaps he felt. Davis's brother is alone, grief-stricken, and from what Peters said, not particularly competent. The danger he poses is limited. Zelda wanted to believe him. The alternative, living in constant fear, looking over their shoulders for the next threat, was untenable. "Let's talk of something else," she suggested, deliberately lightening her tone. "Tell me more about the spring roundup you mentioned. It sounds fascinating." Yates followed her lead, describing the annual gathering of cattle that had scattered across the winter range, the branding of new calves, the camaraderie of the cowboys working from dawn till dusk. His deep voice and the crackling fire eventually lulled Zelda into a sense of security, the threat of Hiram Davis receding to a distant concern. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Yates insisting on taking the small sofa, while Zelda used her bedroom, she found herself reflecting on the peculiar balance of danger and peace that seemed to characterize life in the West. Violence could erupt at any moment, yet between those moments lay a profound tranquility and beauty she had never experienced in Boston. "Yates," she called softly from her doorway, watching him arrange a blanket on the too-short sofa. "Do you ever think of leaving, finding somewhere safer?" He looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, particularly now with you to consider, but the truth is, Zelda, danger exists everywhere in different forms. In Boston, it might wear a different face, but it's still present." "That's surprisingly philosophical," she observed with a small smile. "I've had good teachers recently," he replied, his own lips quirking upward. "A certain schoolmarm with a fondness for transcendentalists comes to mind." Zelda laughed softly. "Good night, Yates." Sleep well if that's possible on that sofa. Good night, my love. Don't worry about me. I've slept on the ground in rainstorms. This is luxury by comparison. As Zelda closed her door, she found comfort in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with Yates beside her, a partnership of equals, bound by respect as much as by love. The threat posed by Hiram Davis proved less immediate than they had feared. True to the sheriff's word, he was escorted to the edge of town the following morning and strongly encouraged to continue his journey elsewhere. Whether it was the sheriff's persuasion or his own recognition of the futility of his mission, Davis departed without further incident, heading south toward Denver. Winter deepened, bringing Christmas festivities that Zelda had never experienced in quite the same way before. The entire town gathered for a celebration at the church, with a community dinner and simple gifts exchanged. Zelda's students performed a nativity play she had organized, bringing tears to many parents' eyes despite the occasional forgotten line or misplaced prop. Yates presented Zelda with a beautiful engagement ring on Christmas Eve, a single diamond set in gold, simple but elegant. "It belonged to my grandmother," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "My mother sent it when I wrote to tell her about you." "It's beautiful," Zelda whispered, deeply moved by the family connection. "Will your mother be able to attend our wedding?" "She hopes to," Yates said. "It's a long journey from Texas, especially for a woman of her age, but she's determined to meet the woman who finally captured her eldest son's heart." Zelda had written to her own relatives in Boston, announcing her engagement with more apprehension than joy. Their response, when it eventually arrived, was predictably cold expressions of surprise that she had found someone willing to overlook her peculiarities, and regrets that they would be unable to travel such a distance for the ceremony. "It's for the best," Zelda told Yates, though the rejection stung despite her strained relationship with her extended family. "They never approved of my decision to come west." "Their loss," Yates said simply, gathering her into his arms. "You'll have a new family now, one that appreciates you precisely as you are." As winter gradually yielded to spring, Zelda found herself increasingly caught up in preparations for both the wedding and her transition to life at the Triple Diamond. The school trustees had reluctantly accepted her resignation, effective at the end of the term, and begun the search for a replacement teacher. "You've set a high standard, Miss Garrison," Mr. Thompson, Lily's father and head of the school board, told her. "It won't be easy to find someone with your qualifications and dedication." "I've written to several colleagues in the East who might be interested," Zelda assured him, "and I'll be available to help the new teacher settle in before I move to the ranch." Plans for the new school at Triple Diamond progressed as well. Mr. Wilkinson had designated a small outbuilding for conversion into a classroom, and word had spread to neighboring ranches that a proper school would be available for their children beginning in the fall. "You'll have at least 15 students to start," Yates reported after a meeting with Wilkinson and several neighboring ranchers. "Ages 6 to 16, with varying levels of previous education." "A challenge I look forward to," Zelda replied, already making mental notes about curriculum and materials, "though I'll need books and supplies. Wilkinson's authorized me to order whatever you require from Denver." Yates smiled at her enthusiasm. "Within reason, of course." "Of course," Zelda agreed, though her definition of reasonable educational supplies might differ significantly from a rancher's. "I'll prepare a list." Their wedding was set for the first Saturday in June after the spring roundup, but before the busiest part of the summer ranching season. Despite Mrs. Holloway's continued disapproval, most of the town had come to accept the match, and many had expressed their intention to attend the ceremony, which would be held in the town church with a celebration to follow. Zelda had ordered a wedding dress from Denver, simpler than what would have been expected in Boston, but still elegant, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Jenkins had taken charge of the wedding supper arrangements, enlisting help from other supportive townswomen. As the day approached, however, an unexpected complication arose. Yates returned from a trip to Denver with troubling news. "Hiram Davis is back," he told Zelda gravely as they sat in the schoolhouse after the children had been dismissed. Peter's got word from the Denver police. He's been asking questions about us, about the wedding. Zelda felt the now familiar chill of apprehension. After all this time, it's been months. Some hatreds don't fade with time, Yates said grimly. If anything, they fester and grow stronger. What does the sheriff suggest? Additional security at the wedding, deputies posted around the church and at the celebration afterward. Yates ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Zelda had come to recognize as a sign of deep concern. Peters has also telegraphed lawmen in surrounding communities to be on the lookout for Davis. Should we postpone? Zelda asked, though the thought of delaying their marriage was deeply disappointing. Yates considered the question seriously. I don't think so. There's no guarantee Davis will make a move now or in a month or ever. We can't put our lives on indefinite hold because of his threats. But if he were to disrupt the wedding or worse, we'll be prepared, Yates assured her. Every man at the Triple Diamond has volunteered to stand guard if needed. No one's going to ruin our day, Zelda. She nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. Then we proceed as planned. As planned, he agreed, taking her hands in his. In 2 weeks, you'll be Mrs. Yates Keller, threats or no threats. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations and heightened vigilance. Sheriff Peters reported no sign of Davis in Pinewood Springs, though rumors placed him in a town 30 miles east, still asking questions about Yates and making vague threats when drunk on the morning of the wedding. Zelda woke early in her room at Mrs. Jenkins's boarding house, where she had moved temporarily after the school term ended. Sunlight streamed through the window, promising a beautiful June day for the ceremony. Mrs. Jenkins brought her breakfast on a tray, exclaiming over the perfect weather and the excitement in town. Everyone's talking about it, dear. First wedding we've had in nearly a year, and such a lovely couple you make. Is there any word? Zelda began hesitantly. About that Davis fellow, Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. Not a peep. Sheriff's men have been watching the roads since dawn, and there's no sign of him. You just put it out of your mind and enjoy your day. Easier said than done, Zelda thought, but she was determined not to let fear overshadow the joy of marrying Yates. She bathed and dressed with care, accepting Mrs. Jenkins's help with her hair and the final adjustments to her wedding gown. By the time they left for the church, Zelda had almost managed to push thoughts of Hiram Davis from her mind. The town looked festive, with many businesses closed for the occasion, and people in their Sunday best making their way toward the white clapboard church at the end of the main street. Inside, the simple sanctuary had been decorated with wildflowers and ribbons, the wooden pews filled with familiar faces. Zelda waited in a small anteroom while the guests were seated, Mrs. Jenkins fussing over her veil and the arrangement of her bouquet. When the organ began to play, Zelda took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway of the sanctuary. The assembled guests rose, turning to watch her progress. But Zelda had eyes only for Yates, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of such love and wonder that it brought tears to her own. She moved slowly down the aisle, each step bringing her closer to the future they had planned together. Mr. Thompson, in lieu of her absent father, escorted her, his presence a reminder of the community that had, for the most part, come to accept and support her. When she reached Yates, he took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "You're breathtaking," he whispered as they turned to face the minister. The ceremony proceeded with traditional simplicity, their vows exchanged in clear, steady voices that carried to the back of the church. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Yates's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, drawing a few chuckles and one whoop of approval from the cowboys in attendance. As they turned to face their guests, now officially Mr. and Mrs. Keller, the church doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the sanctuary. Hiram Davis stood in the doorway, disheveled and wild-eyed, a revolver in each hand. "Keller," he roared, raising one gun. "You killed my brother." Time seemed to slow. Zelda felt Yates pushing her behind him, reaching for his own weapon absent. She realized with a jolt of terror. because he had removed his gun belt for the ceremony. Sheriff Peters and his deputies were moving from their positions near the door, but Davis had the advantage of surprise. He fired once, the shot deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Women screamed, men ducked for cover, and Zelda saw Yates stagger backward, his face contorted in pain. "Yates!" she cried, catching him as he fell, feeling the warm wetness of blood spreading across the front of his new suit. Davis raised his gun again, his face a mask of hatred, but before he could fire a second time, multiple shots rang out from different directions. The Triple Diamond Cowboys, true to their word, had come armed despite the occasion. Davis jerked violently as bullets struck him from several angles, then collapsed in the church doorway, his unfired second gun clattering to the floor. Chaos erupted, but Zelda remained focused entirely on Yates, now lying on the church floor with his head in her lap, his breathing labored. "Stay with me," she pleaded, pressing her hand against the wound in his left shoulder, trying to stem the blood flow. "Yates, please stay with me." His eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. "Not how I planned, our wedding day," he managed, the attempt at humor breaking her heart. "Don't speak," Zelda ordered, her teacher's authority asserting itself through her panic. "Save your strength." Dr. Wilson, the town physician, pushed through the crowd that had gathered around them, his medical bag already open. "Let me see him," he directed, gently moving Zelda's blood-soaked hands aside to examine the wound. "Clean through the shoulder, missed the vital areas from the look of it. He'll need stitching and we'll have a devil of a time with infection, but if we're lucky." "I'll live," Yates finished weakly. "Takes more than a Davis to kill me." "Hush," Zelda admonished, though relief was beginning to replace terror as the doctor's assessment registered. "Do as the doctor says." Yates was carried to the doctor's office, Zelda following in her blood-stained wedding dress, the celebration forgotten in the emergency. The next hours passed in a blur of anxiety as doctor. Wilson cleaned and stitched the wound, administered laudanum for the pain, and finally declared that, with proper care, Yates should make a full recovery. "He'll need rest, absolute rest, for at least 2 weeks," the doctor told Zelda. "Then limited movement of that arm for another month or more. No riding, no roping, nothing strenuous." "I'll see to it," Zelda promised, steel in her voice. Her new husband might be stubborn, but he would find her equally so when it came to his recovery. Word came that Hiram Davis was dead, struck by at least 4 bullets from the Cowboys' guns. Sheriff Peters had declared the shooting justified, given the circumstances, and no charges would be filed against the men who had defended the wedding party. "It's over," Mrs. Jenkins said when she came to the doctor's office, bringing clean clothes for Zelda and the news about Davis. "Truly over this time, that family can't hurt either of you again." Zelda nodded, too exhausted for words. The day that should have been filled with joy and celebration had instead become a nightmare of violence and fear. Yet as she looked at Yates, sleeping now under the influence of the laudanum, she felt a profound gratitude that they had both survived to face whatever came next. "What about the wedding supper?" she asked suddenly, remembering all the preparations that had been made. "All that food, the effort everyone put in." "Don't you worry about that," Mrs. Jenkins assured her. "The celebration's been postponed, not canceled. When Yates is well enough, we'll have a proper reception for you both." Zelda smiled tiredly. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins, for everything." "You rest now, dear. I'll bring some dinner for you later." The older woman patted her hand. "You're a married woman now, even if the day didn't go quite as planned." After she had gone, Zelda pulled her chair closer to Yates's bedside, taking his uninjured hand in hers. In sickness and in health, she had promised just hours ago. Little had she known how soon that vow would be tested, but they had survived. Davis was gone, the threat he represented finally and completely eliminated. Ahead lay recovery, adjustment, the building of their life together at the Triple Diamond. It would not be easy, nothing worthwhile ever was, but they would face it together, as equals, as partners. As Yates stirred, his eyes blinking open with the hazy confusion of one emerging from drugged sleep, Zelda leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Welcome back, husband," she whispered, We have a lifetime ahead of us, his lips curved in a weak smile. Looking forward to it. Wife, the following weeks were a time of healing and adjustment for the newly married Kellers. Yates proved to be a difficult patient, chafing against the restrictions imposed by his injury and constantly attempting to do more than Dr. Wilson had permitted. "You're worse than the schoolchildren," Zelda scolded when she caught him trying to chop wood one-handed, barely 10 days after the shooting. "At least they listen when I tell them something is dangerous." "I'm going mad with inactivity," Yates complained, though he allowed her to lead him back into Mrs. Jenkins's parlor, where they had taken temporary residence during his recovery. "The ranch needs me, Zelda. Roundup's barely finished, and there's fencing to be repaired, cattle to be moved to summer pasture, and capable men to do all of that in your absence," she reminded him firmly. "Mr. Wilkinson himself said you're not to worry, that everything is under control." Yates subsided with poor grace, though his expression softened as he looked at his wife. "You're right, as usual. I'm not being fair to you, am I? This isn't exactly the honeymoon I promised." "We'll have time for that," Zelda assured him, settling beside him on the sofa. "When you're fully recovered." Despite Yates's impatience, it was nearly a month before Dr. Wilson declared him fit to return to light duties at the ranch. Their delayed wedding reception was held the weekend before their departure from town, a joyous affair at the hotel that the entire community attended, even Mrs. Holloway and her circle, who had apparently revised their opinion of the match in light of recent events. "Such devotion, Mrs. Holloway told Zelda with surprising warmth. "The way you cared for him after that terrible shooting, perhaps you're more suited to be a rancher's wife than I initially thought." Zelda accepted the backhanded compliment with as much grace as she could muster. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. We're very happy together." Their arrival at the Triple Diamond was marked by a smaller but equally heartfelt celebration, the ranch hands having decorated the foreman's cabin with bunting and wildflowers. The renovation Yates had ordered was complete, transforming the simple structure into a comfortable home with a proper bedroom, an expanded kitchen, and a small study for Zelda. "It's perfect," she told Yates as they stood in the doorway of what would be their home. "Absolutely perfect." "Not quite what you were used to in Boston," he observed, watching her face carefully. "Better," Zelda said with complete sincerity, "because it's ours." The summer passed in a whirl of activity as they settled into married life and Zelda prepared for the opening of the ranch school. Yates's strength returned gradually, his arm regaining function though the scar would remain, a permanent reminder of their interrupted wedding. Zelda found ranch life both more challenging and more rewarding than she had anticipated. The isolation took some adjustment after the relative sociability of town, but she discovered a deep satisfaction in the rhythm of days marked by sunrise and sunset, rather than social engagements. She learned to ride properly, to cook on a wood stove, to identify the various birds and plants of the high country. In return, she brought books and music and intellectual conversation to the ranch, organizing a weekly reading group for any hands who were interested and teaching Yates to play chess in the evenings. The school opened in September with 17 students more than initially expected, as word had spread to ranches farther afield. Zelda approached the challenge with her characteristic thoroughness and enthusiasm, developing a curriculum that combined traditional subjects with practical knowledge specific to ranch life. "You're revolutionizing education out here," Yates observed after visiting the school one afternoon and watching her teach a lesson that incorporated mathematics, biology, and animal husbandry in a single hour. "These children are learning things I didn't understand until I'd been working cattle for years. Education should be relevant to the lives students will lead," Zelda explained. "What good is abstract knowledge if it doesn't connect to their reality?" Yates's mother arrived from Texas in October, a tiny, fierce woman who had raised 6 children largely on her own after her husband's early death. Sarah Keller spent 2 weeks at the Triple Diamond, getting to know her new daughter-in-law and inspecting the life her eldest son had built. "She approves of you," Yates told Zelda after his mother's departure. Said you have gumption, which is high praise from her. I liked her immensely, Zelda admitted. She reminds me of my father, practical but principled, with no patience for pretense. As winter approached again, Zelda discovered she was expecting a child news that filled Yates with a mixture of joy and protective concern that Zelda found both touching and slightly exasperating. I'm pregnant, not invalid, she reminded him when he suggested she might need to reduce her teaching hours. Women have been having babies while continuing their work since the beginning of time. Not all women are running schools and managing households in the Colorado mountains, Yates countered, though he knew better than to press the point too forcefully. They compromised, with Zelda agreeing to accept help with the more physically demanding aspects of her work as her pregnancy progressed, and Yates promising not to hover excessively or treat her as if she might break at any moment. The baby was due in late June, a timing that Zelda noted with amusement would mark almost exactly a year since their wedding. Hopefully with less drama this time, she added, touching the scar on Yates's shoulder that still pained him in cold weather. Christmas that year was especially meaningful, celebrated with the ranch community in the main house, with music and food and small gifts exchanged. Zelda, not yet showing her pregnancy but glowing with health and happiness, played carols on the piano Mr. Wilkinson had recently acquired for his wife, while Yates led the Cowboys in slightly off-key but enthusiastic singing. Looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight and candles, Zelda felt a profound sense of belonging that she had never experienced in Boston. These people, from Mr. Wilkinson's refined wife to the roughest cowhand, had accepted her for herself, valuing her contributions to their community without trying to confine her to conventional roles. Later, as she and Yates walked back to their cabin under a sky brilliant with stars, she shared this thought with him. It's ironic, she mused, her arm linked through his. In Boston, I was considered unfit for marriage because I was too educated, too independent, too outspoken. Here, those very qualities are what make me valuable. Yates stopped, turning to face her in the starlight. You were never unfit for marriage, Zelda. You were simply waiting for the right marriage, one that would strengthen rather than diminish you. And I found it, she said softly, with a cowboy who saw perfection where others saw flaws. Not a very poetic cowboy, Yates admitted with a smile, but one who knows quality when he sees it. Poetry enough for me, Zelda assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him beneath the winter stars, her heart full of gratitude for the unexpected path that had led her to this man, this place, this life. Spring came early to the high country that year, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows by early May and cattle already being moved to summer pastures before the traditional start of the season. Zelda's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though she found herself tiring more easily as the baby grew and the school year approached its end. By mutual agreement, she had arranged for one of the older students, a 17-year-old girl named Martha with a natural gift for teaching, to serve as her assistant for the final months of the term. Martha would continue as a substitute teacher during the summer while Zelda adjusted to motherhood, with the plan for Zelda to resume full teaching duties in the fall. You've thought of everything, Yates observed one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. I should have known you'd approach motherhood with the same thorough planning you bring to everything else. Not everything can be planned, Zelda reminded him, her hand resting on her rounded belly where their child moved energetically. But I see no reason to abandon my work entirely when arrangements can be made to accommodate both roles. Yates covered her hand with his own. Our child is fortunate to have a mother who will demonstrate that a woman can be many things at once: teacher, wife, mother, intellectual. And our child will have a father who values those qualities, Zelda added softly. That may be the greatest fortune of all. Their son was born on a perfect June morning, arriving with such speed and determination that the doctor barely made it from town in time. Yates, who had refused to leave Zelda's side despite the doctor's initial protests, was the first to hold the red-faced, squalling infant after the midwife had cleaned and swaddled him. "He has your temper," Yates joked, his voice rough with emotion as he placed the baby in Zelda's arms. "And your way of making his opinions known." "Poor child," Zelda murmured, gazing down at the tiny face with wonder and exhaustion, to be saddled with two such stubborn parents. They named him William, after Zelda's father, with Thomas as a middle name to honor Yates's brother who had fallen in the war. William Thomas Keller announced his arrival to the ranch with lusty cries that, according to the Cowboys, could be heard all the way to the bunkhouse. "A good set of lungs," Mr. Wilkinson approved when he came to offer his congratulations. "He'll be calling cattle before you know it, Keller, or reciting Shakespeare," Yates countered with a proud smile. "With his mother's influence, anything's possible." The summer passed in a blur of adjustments as Zelda and Yates adapted to parenthood. William proved to be a generally good-natured baby, though with a definite preference for his own way that both parents recognized as a reflection of themselves. By September, when the ranch school reopened for the fall term, Zelda had established a routine that allowed her to teach while still caring for William. Martha continued as her assistant, taking over the classroom when the baby needed attention, and several of the ranch women took turns watching him during lessons. "It takes a community," Zelda told Mrs. Wilkinson, who had been particularly supportive of her determination to continue teaching. "In Boston, I would have been expected to withdraw entirely from public life during early motherhood. Frontier women don't have that luxury," Mrs. Wilkinson replied practically. "We've always worked alongside our men, babies in tow. Your way just involves books instead of butter churns." As William grew from infant to toddler, Zelda found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this life. The pain of her broken engagement to Henry, once so acute, now seemed like a distant memory, a necessary step on the path to where she truly belonged. Any regrets? Yates asked her on the evening of their second wedding anniversary as they sat on their porch watching William toddle after fireflies in the gathering dusk. "About what?" Zelda asked, though she knew what he meant. "About choosing this life, a ranch in Colorado instead of a mansion in Boston. A cowboy husband instead of a banker or lawyer, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse instead of in some prestigious academy." Zelda considered the question seriously, as she did all questions. "I regret that my father never met you or William. He would have loved you both." She reached for Yates's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "But no, I have no regrets about the choices that brought me here. This is where I was meant to be, though I never would have predicted it. Even with the dangers we've faced, Davis, the harsh winters, the isolation." "Even with those," she confirmed, "because they're part of a life that allows me to be fully myself, not just the acceptable parts, but all of me. The teacher, the thinker, the woman who loves a man who loves her exactly as she is." Yates squeezed her hand. "They called you unfit for marriage," he said softly, recalling the cruel assessment that had followed her from Boston to Pinewood Springs. "And you said I was perfect for you," Zelda finished, smiling at the memory. "You were right, as it turns out." "I usually am," he replied with a hint of his old cowboy swagger, "though I'm wise enough not to point that out too often to a wife who can quote Aristotle while changing diapers." Zelda laughed, the sound mingling with their son's delighted squeals as he captured a lightning bug in his small hands, his face alight with wonder in the gathering darkness. In that moment, watching her husband and child against the backdrop of mountains and endless sky, Zelda Garrison Keller knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the love of a man who had seen perfection where others saw only flaws, and in the life they were building together on the wild, beautiful frontier.